The rain was pattering against the conference room windows of Martinez Associates Consulting as Senior Partner Rebecca Martinez sat quietly at the mahogany table, her hands folded neatly over a stack of quarterly reports. At 34, she looked younger than her years, with shoulder-length auburn hair and a soft-spoken demeanor that most people mistook for weakness. What her husband David and the other partners didn't know was that this unassuming woman had once commanded a logistics unit of 200 soldiers in Iraq, turning impossible supply chains into military victories. Little did David know he was about to underestimate the wrong veteran. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The Seattle skyline gleamed through the rain-streaked windows of the 32nd floor conference room, the Space Needle barely visible through the gray October mist. Martinez and Associates Consulting occupied the entire floor of the Columbia Center, its glass walls offering commanding views of Elliott Bay and the Olympic Mountains beyond. The conference room itself was a testament to corporate success. Polished mahogany table, leather chairs, and awards lining the walls from their work with Fortune 500 companies. The atmosphere was heavy with the kind of tension that comes before difficult conversations, the air conditioning humming quietly as it fought against the building storm outside. Rebecca Martinez adjusted her navy blazer and glanced at her watch. The quarterly board meeting was scheduled to start in 15 minutes, but she'd arrived early as always. Her habit of thorough preparation was something she'd carried over from her 8 years in the Army, though none of her colleagues knew about that chapter of her life. To them, she was simply David's wife who somehow ended up with a senior partnership in what had originally been his father's firm. They saw her quiet demeanor during meetings, her tendency to listen more than speak, and her preference for working behind the scenes as signs of passivity rather than strategic thinking. The conference table was already set with copies of the quarterly performance reports she'd spent the weekend preparing. Each document was meticulously organized, color-coded, and backed by data that told a story her business partners weren't expecting to hear. Rebecca had learned long ago that preparation was the difference between victory and defeat. Whether you were managing supply convoys through hostile territory or navigating corporate boardrooms filled with skeptical executives. Her fingers traced the edge of her portfolio, feeling the familiar weight of documentation that would soon change everything. Outside, the rain continued its steady rhythm against the windows, creating a peaceful backdrop that reminded Rebecca of the rainy Seattle mornings when she first returned from deployment 5 years ago. Back then, she'd been grateful for David's offer to join his family's consulting firm, even if it meant starting at the bottom despite her MBA from Wharton and her proven leadership experience overseas. What she hadn't anticipated was how that gratitude would slowly transform into something that felt uncomfortably close to dependence, at least in everyone else's eyes. The office was unusually quiet for a Wednesday afternoon. Most of the support staff had gone home early due to the storm, leaving only the partners and senior executives for today's crucial meeting. Rebecca could hear the distant hum of the coffee machine in the break room and the occasional rumble of thunder rolling across Puget Sound. These quarterly meetings had become increasingly tense over the past year, as the firm struggled to maintain its client base in an increasingly competitive market. David had been particularly vocal about the need to trim the fat and focus on their core competencies, though his definition of both seemed to shift depending on who was in the room. Rebecca opened her laptop and pulled up the presentation she'd been working on for weeks. The data was undeniable. While the other divisions had seen declining revenues, her logistics and operations consulting wing had grown by 40% this quarter alone. Major clients like Boeing, Amazon, and Microsoft had specifically requested her team's expertise, praising her innovative approaches to supply chain optimization and crisis management. What they didn't know was that every strategy she employed had been tested under fire in the desert highways of Iraq, where a single miscalculation could cost lives instead of just quarterly bonuses. As she reviewed her notes one final time, Rebecca's fingers unconsciously traced the small scar on her left hand, a reminder of the IED explosion that had nearly ended her military career, but had taught her the most valuable lesson of her life. When everything falls apart, the person who can think clearly and act decisively is the one who survives. Today, she had a feeling she was going to need every bit of that hard-earned wisdom. The numbers on her screen told a story that would surprise everyone in this room, including David. who had spent the last 6 months suggesting that her division was underperforming and needed restructuring. She closed her laptop and straightened the papers one final time, her movements precise and economical in the way that came from years of military discipline. Through the windows, she could see the first of her colleagues arriving in the lobby 32 floors below, their umbrellas barely visible as they hurried through the storm. In 10 minutes, this conference room would be filled with the firm's 5 senior partners, all men, all convinced they understood exactly how this meeting would unfold. Rebecca allowed herself a small knowing smile as she thought about the expression on David's face when he realized how wrong he was about to be. Rebecca's mind drifted to the conversation she'd had with her 8-year-old daughter Emma that morning over breakfast. "Mommy, why does Daddy always sound angry when he talks about your work?" Emma had asked, her innocent blue eyes searching Rebecca's face for an answer that wouldn't shatter her world. Rebecca had smiled and ruffled her daughter's hair, telling her that grown-ups sometimes get stressed about business things, but inside her heart had broken a little more. Emma was the reason Rebecca endured David's increasingly dismissive attitude. The reason she'd swallowed her pride when he introduced her as my wife who helps out at the office at company events, and the reason she'd built her division into the most profitable part of the company while everyone assumed she was just playing house. The photo on her desk caught the afternoon light filtering through the storm clouds, showing Emma at her school science fair last month proudly displaying her volcano project. Rebecca had been the one to help her with the research, explaining chemical reactions with the same precision she'd once used to calculate fuel consumption rates for convoy missions across hostile territory. David had missed the fair entirely, claiming an important client dinner that Rebecca later discovered was actually a golf game with his college buddies. These small betrayals had accumulated over the years like sediment in a riverbed, slowly changing the landscape of their marriage. Rebecca remembered the day she'd first walked into this office 5 years ago, fresh from her final deployment, and eager to start the civilian life she'd dreamed about during those long nights in forward operating base Liberty. David had been charming then, introducing her to his father's legacy firm with pride, talking about how her military logistics background would be a nice addition to the team. What she hadn't realized was that he saw her expertise as a novelty rather than an asset, something interesting to mention at cocktail parties rather than a genuine competitive advantage for the business. The irony wasn't lost on her that while David struggled to manage the firm's traditional consulting services, losing 3 major accounts this quarter alone, she had quietly revolutionized their operations division. Her military contacts had opened doors that old boy network connections couldn't touch. When Boeing needed someone who understood the complexity of global supply chains under pressure, they called her. When Amazon required crisis management consulting for their distribution network, her name was the first on their list. She built relationships based on competence rather than connections, delivering results that spoke louder than any resume ever could. The rain intensified against the windows, creating rivulets that reminded Rebecca of the tears she'd shed in private after last month's partners' meeting. David had suggested in front of everyone that her division might be better suited as a support function rather than a standalone profit center. The other partners had nodded thoughtfully as if the woman who'd increased their revenue by 40% was somehow incapable of understanding business strategy. She'd sat there, hands folded, listening to them discuss her future as if she weren't in the room, the same way her male colleagues in the army had once questioned her ability to lead supply convoys through insurgent territory. But today was different. Today she had the quarterly reports that would show exactly who was contributing what to Martinez Associates. The numbers were stark and undeniable. Her operations consulting division had not only outperformed every other department, but had essentially subsidized their loss. While David's traditional management consulting had declined 23%, while his partner Jake's financial advisory services had lost their 2 biggest clients, and while the firm's overall reputation had suffered from a series of high-profile mistakes, her division had grown exponentially. Rebecca opened her purse and pulled out the letter she'd been carrying for 2 weeks, folded carefully and tucked behind Emma's latest school photo. It was an offer from Lockheed Martin to head their new civilian consulting branch, with a salary that was nearly double what she made as a senior partner, and the respect that came with recognition of her actual capability. She'd been tempted to accept it immediately, to walk away from the constant undermining and dismissive comments, but something deeper drove her to stay and fight this battle on her own terms. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The elevator chimed in the distance, signaling the arrival of the first partner. Rebecca slipped the letter back into her purse and checked her reflection in her phone screen. She looked exactly like what she was, a professional woman prepared for an important meeting. What they couldn't see was the steel underneath, forged in the crucible of military leadership and tempered by years of proving herself in rooms full of men who assumed she didn't belong. As she heard familiar voices approaching down the hallway, Rebecca straightened her shoulders and prepared for the confrontation that would finally reveal who she really was. The familiar sound of David's laugh echoed down the marble hallway, that particular brand of corporate humor that Rebecca had learned to recognize as a warning sign. It was the laugh he used when he was about to say something cutting disguised as a joke, the same tone he'd adopted 6 months ago when he'd suggested she might be more comfortable in a support role. Rebecca's military-trained senses kicked in automatically, cataloging the voices approaching the conference room. David's booming confidence, Jake Patterson's nervous chuckle, and the deeper rumble of senior partner Marcus Webb, discussing quarterly projections with the casual authority of someone who'd never had his competence questioned. Through the glass walls, Rebecca could see them gathered near the coffee station, steam rising from their cups as they huddled in what looked like a pre-meeting strategy session. David stood at the center, gesticulating with the kind of animated confidence that came from believing your audience was captive. His expensive suit was perfectly tailored, his silver hair styled with the precision that came from a monthly appointment at Seattle's most exclusive salon, and his posture radiated the kind of entitlement that Rebecca had learned to read, like a weather system approaching from the horizon. Jake Patterson, the firm's financial advisory partner, nodded along with David's every word like a bobblehead on a dashboard. At 42, Jake had the soft appearance of someone who'd never faced real adversity, his pale complexion and nervous energy reminding Rebecca of the junior officers she'd commanded who confused volume with authority. She watched him glance toward the conference room, his expression carrying that particular mix of superiority and discomfort that men wore when they were about to discuss the woman problem in their organization. Marcus Webb, the eldest partner and unofficial patriarch of the firm since David's father retired, stood slightly apart from the group with the kind of detached observation that Rebecca recognized from her military days. He was the type who preferred to let others reveal their positions before committing to his own, a strategy that had served him well in 40 years of corporate consulting but also made him dangerous in situations like this. Rebecca had learned to respect his tactical intelligence even as she prepared to outmaneuver it. The storm outside had intensified, rain now driving against the windows with enough force to create a constant drumming that seemed to echo Rebecca's heart. She could feel the familiar pre-combat alertness settling over her, the same heightened awareness that had kept her alive during convoy missions through hostile territory. Every detail became sharp and significant, the way David's voice carried just a little too loudly as if he wanted her to hear his confidence, the nervous energy radiating from Jake as he kept glancing at his phone, the careful neutrality of Marcus's expression as he listened without committing. Rebecca opened her portfolio one final time, running her finger down the column of numbers that told the real story of Martinez Associates. Her operations division hadn't just succeeded, it had become the backbone of the entire firm while everyone else struggled with declining revenues and lost clients. The Boeing contract alone was worth more than David's entire traditional consulting division had generated this quarter, and the Amazon account had brought in revenue that had literally kept the firm afloat during their worst month in 5 years. Yet somehow she was still seen as the junior partner who needed guidance and oversight. The irony would have been amusing if it weren't so frustrating. While David pontificated about market strategies and brand positioning, Rebecca had been quietly building relationships with the kind of high-value clients who chose consultants based on demonstrated competence rather than golf handicap. Her military background had taught her that results mattered more than rhetoric, that reliability under pressure was worth more than charm at cocktail parties, and that the best leaders were often the ones who spoke least and delivered most. She could hear David's voice growing louder as the group began moving toward the conference room, his tone carrying that particular edge that meant he was building towards something he considered clever. Rebecca had learned to recognize the signs over 5 years of marriage and 3 years of working together. the way his shoulders squared when he was preparing to assert dominance, the slight tilt of his head that preceded what he thought were devastating observation, the pause he always took before delivering what he considered his trump card. The conference room door opened with a soft whoosh of displaced air, and David's voice filled the space with artificial warmth. "Well, if it isn't our dedicated early bird," he announced, his tone carrying just enough condescension to make the compliment feel like an insult. The other partners filed in behind him, their expressions ranging from polite interest to barely concealed anticipation, as if they were settling in to watch a performance rather than participate in a business meeting. Rebecca stood as they entered, her movement fluid and controlled in the way that military training had made automatic. She offered a professional smile and a brief nod, the same greeting she'd perfected for dealing with superior officers who underestimated her capability. What none of them realized was that this quiet, respectful demeanor wasn't submission, it was strategy. She'd learned long ago that the best time to reveal your strength was when your opponents had committed to underestimating you. David settled into his chair at the head of the conference table with the casual authority of someone who'd never questioned his right to be there. The mahogany surface reflected the storm clouds gathering outside, creating an almost theatrical backdrop for what Rebecca sensed would be anything but a routine, quarterly review. Marcus Webb took his customary seat to David's right, opening his leather portfolio with the methodical precision of a man who'd conducted thousands of similar meetings. Jake Patterson claimed the chair across from Rebecca, his nervous energy making him fidget with his Mont Blanc pen as he avoided direct eye contact. "Well, team," David began, his voice carrying the practiced warmth of someone launching into a familiar routine, "another quarter in the books, and I think we have some important strategic decisions to discuss." He gestured toward the stack of reports Rebecca had prepared, though she noticed he hadn't actually opened his copy yet. "Rebecca's put together our usual comprehensive analysis, and I'm sure we'll find some interesting insights in there." The way he said usual made it sound like a burden rather than an asset, as if her thoroughness was somehow excessive rather than professional. Rebecca watched him perform what she'd come to recognize as his standard opening ritual, the adjustment of his tie, the clearing of his throat, and the slight forward lean that signaled he was transitioning into what he considered his authoritative mode. She'd observed these same behavioral patterns in commanding officers who relied more on rank than competence, men who confused position with leadership and assumed that volume could substitute for substance. The familiarity of it was almost comforting in its predictability. "Before we dive into the numbers," David continued, reaching for his coffee with the unhurried confidence of someone who believed he controlled the room's tempo, "I think it's important that we address some broader organizational questions that have been on my mind." Marcus nodded thoughtfully, his expression giving nothing away, while Jake's pen clicking intensified to the point where it became audible over the rain drumming against the window. Rebecca maintained her neutral expression, but internally, her military-trained instincts were cataloging every micro-expression and vocal inflection. The quarterly review meetings had followed the same pattern for the past 3 years. David would spend the first 20 minutes discussing strategic vision and market positioning while the actual performance data sat ignored on the table. He'd reference client relationships that existed primarily in his imagination, discuss market trends he'd read about in Harvard Business Review, and pontificate about the consulting industry's future with the confidence of someone who'd inherited his position rather than earned it. Only after this performance would they actually examine the numbers that told the real story of their company's health. Rebecca had learned to use this time productively, mentally rehearsing her presentation while observing the dynamics at play around the table. Marcus Webb's reputation as a shrewd operator was well-deserved. She could see him calculating angles and assessing positions even during David's routine monologue. Jake Patterson's nervousness was more transparent, his discomfort with conflict making him an unreliable ally for anyone seeking confrontation. But David himself was the most interesting study, his confidence so absolute that he seemed genuinely unaware of the gap between his perception and reality. "The market's been challenging this year," David was saying, his tone shifting into what Rebecca recognized as his setup mode, the verbal preparation for conclusions he'd already reached. "Competition is fierce, client expectations are higher, and frankly, some of our traditional approaches aren't generating the results we need." He paused for effect, glancing around the table as if expecting agreement. Which brings me to some difficult conversations we need to have about restructuring and efficiency. Rebecca felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the same sensation she'd experienced moments before receiving hostile fire during convoy operations in Iraq. Her body's early warning system, honed by years of military service, was telling her that the real meeting was about to begin. David's preamble was ending, and whatever he'd planned with Marcus and Jake during their hallway consultation was about to be revealed. She thought of Emma, probably working on homework at her after-school program, and strengthened her resolve to fight for the stability her daughter deserved. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on her. While David spoke about efficiency and results, the quarterly report sitting in front of him contained data that would fundamentally challenge everything he was about to propose. Her operations consulting division hadn't just succeeded, it had become the financial engine of the entire firm. The Boeing account had generated more revenue in 3 months than David's traditional consulting had produced all year. The Amazon contract had literally saved them from bankruptcy during their worst quarter in company history. Yet somehow, she suspected, her success was about to be framed as a problem rather than a solution. Rebecca adjusted her posture slightly, a subtle shift that centered her balance and prepared her for whatever was coming next. In military terms, this was the moment when intelligence gathering ended and tactical response began. She'd spent 3 years watching, learning, and building her position from the inside. Now, as David's voice took on the particular cadence that preceded his most significant announcements, she prepared to discover exactly what battle she was about to fight. David's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, the genial mask of routine business sliding away to reveal something sharper underneath. Rebecca had seen this transformation before, usually right before he delivered what he considered devastating professional critiques disguised as constructive feedback. He leaned back in his chair with calculated casualness, creating the kind of physical distance that suggested he was about to deliver uncomfortable truths from a position of moral authority. "Now I know this might be difficult to hear," David began, his voice taking on the patronizing tone he typically reserved for explaining basic business concepts to clients he considered intellectually inferior. "But we need to have an honest conversation about performance and contribution." The word contribution hung in the air like smoke from a warning flare, and Rebecca felt her military-trained awareness sharpen to combat readiness. She'd heard enough briefings to recognize when someone was preparing to deliver a predetermined conclusion wrapped in the language of objective analysis. Marcus Webb shifted slightly in his chair, his expression maintaining its carefully neutral mask, while his eyes moved between David and Rebecca with the calculation of someone watching a chess match unfold. Jake Patterson's pen clicking had stopped entirely, replaced by the kind of frozen attention that suggested he was witnessing something he'd been prepared for but still found uncomfortable to watch. The conference room's atmosphere had transformed from routine business meeting to something that felt distinctly like a tribunal. "Rebecca," David continued, and the way he said her name carried just enough familiarity to remind everyone present that this was personal as well as professional. "I think we need to address some concerns that have been raised about the sustainability and integration of your operations division." He gestured vaguely toward her reports, though Rebecca noticed he still hadn't opened his copy or examined any of the actual data she'd compiled. "While I appreciate your enthusiasm and your unique approach to client relations, there are questions about whether your methods align with our firm's established protocols and long-term strategic vision." The carefully constructed language didn't disguise what Rebecca recognized as a classic undermining tactic, one she'd encountered from insecure superior officers who felt threatened by subordinates who delivered results through unconventional methods. David was questioning her competence while pretending to praise her effort, suggesting that her success was somehow accidental or unsustainable rather than the result of superior strategy and execution. It was a technique designed to make her defensive, to force her to justify achievements that should have spoken for themselves. "I'm particularly concerned," David added, warming to his theme with the confidence of someone who believed he was building an unassailable case, "about the way your division operates somewhat independently from our core consulting methodology. While independence can be valuable, we need to ensure that all our departments are working toward unified objectives, rather than pursuing individual agendas." The phrase individual agendas was delivered with just enough emphasis to suggest that Rebecca's success was somehow selfish rather than beneficial to the firm as a whole. Rebecca maintained her professional composure, but internally she was translating David's corporate speak into the direct language she'd learned in military briefings. He was essentially arguing that her division's success was a problem because it hadn't been achieved through the traditional methods that he understood and controlled. Her ability to win major contracts through demonstrated competence rather than inherited relationships was being framed as a deviation from proper protocol rather than a competitive advantage that had literally saved the company. Jake Patterson finally found his voice, though it carried the tremulous quality of someone repeating rehearsed lines rather than expressing genuine conviction. David raises some valid concerns about operational consistency, he offered, his words sounding like he was reading from a script. We need to ensure that all our divisions are following established best practices and maintaining appropriate oversight structures. The way he avoided direct eye contact with Rebecca while speaking suggested he understood exactly how hollow his contributions sounded. Marcus Webb remained silent, his expression giving nothing away as he observed the dynamic unfolding around the table. Rebecca recognized his tactical patience from her own military experience. He was the type who preferred to let others reveal their positions before committing to any particular course of action. His silence was strategic rather than neutral, though whether he was calculating how to support David's position or preparing to exploit its weaknesses remained unclear. The bottom line, David continued, his confidence building as he moved toward what Rebecca sensed was his prepared conclusion, is that we need to have a serious discussion about restructuring your role within the organization. Perhaps something that better utilizes your skills while ensuring proper integration with our established systems and oversight protocol. He paused dramatically, as if he'd just delivered a particularly insightful business analysis rather than a thinly veiled demotion disguised as organizational efficiency. Rebecca felt the familiar cold clarity that had served her well during combat situations, the moment when emotional reaction gave way to tactical calculation. David had just fired his opening shot, testing her response while positioning himself as the reasonable authority figure making difficult but necessary decisions. What he didn't realize was that every word he'd spoken had been carefully cataloged by someone trained to recognize threats and respond with overwhelming precision. The real meeting was finally beginning. David's confidence seemed to grow with Rebecca's continued silence, interpreting her professional composure as either acceptance or inability to respond. He leaned forward slightly, adopting the posture of someone preparing to deliver harder truths to an audience he assumed was already defeated. The rain continued its assault against the windows, creating a soundtrack of controlled chaos that seemed to mirror the tension building within the conference room's carefully controlled environment. You know, Rebecca, David continued, his tone shifting to something that carried the false intimacy of someone about to deliver a painful but necessary lesson. I think part of the problem might be that you've never really understood the consulting business from a strategic perspective. He gestured broadly as if encompassing not just the conference room but the entire industry beyond it. Military logistics, while certainly valuable, operates under completely different parameters than corporate consulting. What works in a command structure doesn't necessarily translate to client relationship management. The condescension in his voice was so thick Rebecca could almost taste it, but she recognized the tactical error he was making. By attacking her military background, David was venturing into territory where he had no credibility while she possessed expertise he couldn't begin to comprehend. It was like watching an amateur chess player sacrifice his queen while thinking he was gaining a tactical advantage. She maintained her neutral expression, but internally she was calculating exactly how devastating her response would be when the time came to reveal the true scope of his miscalculation. Marcus Webb's eyebrows rose almost imperceptibly, the first crack in his carefully maintained neutrality. As a Vietnam veteran himself, he understood the implications of David's dismissive reference to military experience in ways that Jake Patterson clearly didn't. Rebecca caught the subtle shift in Marcus's posture, recognizing it as the kind of tactical repositioning that preceded a change in allegiance. David was alienating potential allies with every word, too focused on his immediate target to notice the collateral damage he was inflicting on his own position. Furthermore, David pressed on, his voice gaining momentum as he built toward what he clearly considered his most compelling arguments. There's the question of your actual business development capability. Yes, you've managed to secure some contracts, but let's be honest about how those relationships were really built. He paused dramatically, allowing the implication to hang in the air like smoke from an explosive device. Military connections, government contracts, defense industry relationships. These aren't exactly the kind of sustainable business development strategies that build long-term consulting firms. Rebecca felt something cold and sharp crystallize in her chest, recognizing David's words as a direct attack on her professional integrity. He was suggesting that her success was based on favoritism rather than competence, that her military background was a crutch rather than a competitive advantage. It was the kind of accusation that revealed more about the accuser than the accused, the desperate reasoning of someone who couldn't comprehend success achieved through methods he didn't understand or control. Jake Patterson nodded along with David's assessment, his nervous energy translating into agreement that seemed more reflexive than thoughtful. "That's a really important point about sustainable business development," he offered, his voice carrying the hollow ring of someone repeating concepts he'd heard but never actually implemented. "We need to focus on traditional consulting methodologies that have proven track records rather than relying on specialized connections that might not be available to the broader team." The irony of Jake's comment was almost amusing, coming from someone whose own client relationships consisted primarily of college fraternity brothers and country club acquaintances, who threw him occasional small projects out of social obligation rather than professional respect. Rebecca had reviewed his division's performance metrics enough times to know that his traditional consulting methodologies had resulted in declining revenues and increasingly dissatisfied clients who rarely renewed their contracts or provided referrals. David seized on Jake's support like a drowning man grabbing a life preserver, his confidence returning as he sensed what he interpreted as momentum building in his favor. "Exactly right, Jake. We need to think about scalability and replicability." Rebecca's approach, while producing some short-term results, isn't something we can systematize or teach to other consultants. It's too dependent on her personal background rather than demonstrable business process. The conference room felt increasingly claustrophobic as David's verbal assault continued, the storm outside providing an almost cinematic backdrop to the confrontation unfolding within. Rebecca could feel the weight of the quarterly reports sitting unopened in front of each partner, documents that contained data so devastating to David's narrative that she almost felt sorry for him. Almost. His systematic dismissal of her competence while ignoring objective evidence of her success revealed a level of willful ignorance that bordered on professional negligence. "Which brings me to my main concern," David announced, his tone shifting to what he clearly considered his closing argument. "I think we need to seriously consider whether Rebecca's current role is sustainable for the firm's long-term health. Perhaps a transition to a more supportive position, something that leverages her organizational skills without requiring the kind of independent business development that seems to be causing integration challenges." Rebecca recognized the moment for what it was, David's attempt to deliver what he considered a knockout blow, the carefully planned demotion disguised as organizational restructuring. What he didn't realize was that every word of his attack had been building toward a counteroffensive that would reveal exactly how catastrophically he had misjudged both the situation and his opponent. The conference room door opened with a soft whisper of displaced air, and Sarah Chen, the firm's executive assistant, stepped inside, carrying a stack of documents. Her timing was either coincidental or orchestrated, but Rebecca noticed the way David's expression shifted to mild annoyance at the interruption of what he clearly considered his moment of triumph. Sarah had been with Martinez Associates for over 15 years, having started as David's father's secretary and worked her way up to managing the entire executive staff. More importantly, she was one of the few people in the office who had access to all departmental financial records and client communications. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Sarah said, her voice carrying the polished professionalism of someone who had navigated corporate politics long enough to recognize when important conversations were happening. "But I have the year-end client satisfaction surveys that were requested for today's meeting." She placed a manila folder in front of each partner, her movements efficient and deliberate. Rebecca noticed that Sarah's expression remained carefully neutral, but her eyes lingered on the unopened quarterly reports with what looked like knowing significance. David waved dismissively at the surveys, clearly annoyed that his carefully orchestrated momentum had been broken. "Thank you, Sarah. We'll review those after we finish our current discussion about organizational restructuring." His tone carried the implicit instruction that she should leave immediately, but Sarah remained standing beside the conference table, her professional demeanor intact. but her posture suggesting she had something else to add. Actually, Sarah continued, her voice maintaining its respectful tone while carrying an undertone that Rebecca recognized as barely controlled frustration. There are several client calls waiting for return, specifically from Boeing and Amazon representatives who wanted to discuss expanding their contracts with our operations division. She paused just long enough for the significance of her words to register before adding, they mentioned wanting to speak directly with Rebecca about some urgent supply chain optimization projects that could potentially triple our current engagement with both companies. The conference room fell silent except for the steady drumming of rain against the windows, the weight of Sarah's announcement settling over the group like a tactical nuclear device detonating in slow motion. Rebecca watched David's face cycle through confusion, irritation, and something that looked uncomfortably close to panic as he processed the implications of what Sarah had just revealed. Jake Patterson's nervous pen clicking resumed with increased intensity, while Marcus Webb's carefully maintained neutrality shifted into what Rebecca recognized as sharp interest. Rebecca realized that Sarah's interruption wasn't coincidental at all, but rather the intervention of someone who had witnessed 3 years of David's dismissive treatment of the firm's most successful division. As executive assistant, Sarah had fielded countless calls from high-value clients specifically requesting Rebecca's expertise, had scheduled meetings where major contracts were signed based solely on Rebecca's recommendation, had watched the firm's financial health improve dramatically due to revenue streams that David consistently ignored or minimized. Triple the engagement? Marcus Webb asked, his voice carrying the kind of sharp attention that came from recognizing genuinely significant business opportunity. Sarah, are we talking about expanding the current Boeing logistics contract? Or are they proposing entirely new service areas? His question was directed at Sarah, but his eyes moved between her and Rebecca with the calculation of someone rapidly reassessing the dynamics at play in the conference room. Sarah consulted her notes with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent decades managing executive communications. Boeing wants to expand the current supply chain optimization to include their international manufacturing facilities, and Amazon is interested in bringing Rebecca's team in to handle crisis management protocols for their entire Pacific Northwest distribution network. According to the preliminary discussions, we're looking at approximately $18 million in additional annual revenue if both contracts move forward. The number hung in the air like a challenge to everything David had spent the last 20 minutes arguing. $18 million in additional revenue from clients who had specifically requested Rebecca's expertise, wanted to expand their relationships with her division, and were offering contracts that would fundamentally transform the firm's financial position. It was the kind of business development success that traditional consulting firms spent years trying to achieve, being offered to the woman David had just finished describing as incapable of sustainable business growth. Jake Patterson's pen slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the mahogany table, the small sound unnaturally loud in the sudden silence that had engulfed the conference room. Rebecca could see him mentally calculating what $18 million in additional revenue would mean for his own position within the firm, recognizing that his entire division's annual output was less than what Rebecca's clients were offering to expand by. The mathematics of the situation were becoming impossible to ignore, even for someone as committed to willful blindness as David appeared to be. David's carefully constructed narrative was disintegrating in real time, each word of Sarah's professional report systematically destroying the foundation of his argument about Rebecca's limitations and the unsustainability of her method. The woman he had just finished dismissing as strategically incompetent was apparently so valuable to major clients that they were proactively offering expansions worth more than most consulting firms generated in total annual revenue. Rebecca maintained her professional composure, but internally she was watching David realize that his attempted ambush had just transformed into something far more dangerous for his own position. The witnesses he hadn't planned for were providing testimony that would be impossible to dismiss or rationalize away. David's face cycled through several emotions before settling on something that Rebecca recognized as desperate calculation. She'd seen the same expression on incompetent officers who realized their tactical blunders were about to be exposed to superior command, the moment when professional panic began to override rational decision-making. Instead of retreating or reassessing his position, David doubled down with the reckless aggression of someone who believed his only option was to attack harder. "Sarah, thank you for that information," David said, his voice tight with barely controlled frustration. "But I think you're misunderstanding the broader strategic picture here." He gestured dismissively toward the client information she'd provided, as if $18 million in additional revenue was somehow irrelevant to a discussion about business performance. "These kinds of short-term contract expansions are exactly what I'm talking about when I discuss the problems with Rebecca's approach. They're not sustainable business relationships. They're dependent on personal connections that can't be replicated or systematized." The audacity of David's response left even Marcus Webb visibly stunned. Rebecca watched the senior partner's expression shift from neutral calculation to something approaching disbelief, as if he was witnessing someone argue that gravity was optional. "Sarah," Chan's professional composure cracked slightly, her eyebrows rising in an expression of incredulity that she quickly suppressed. The room's atmosphere had moved beyond tension into the realm of surreal confrontation. "Furthermore," David continued, his confidence building as he convinced himself that his revised strategy was working, "I think we need to examine whether these client relationships are actually beneficial for the firm's long-term reputation. Military contractors and government-adjacent companies aren't exactly the kind of prestigious clients that elevate a consulting firm's brand position in the marketplace." His words carried the casual dismissiveness of someone who had never actually secured a major client through his own efforts, critiquing success he couldn't understand through metrics he'd never achieved. Rebecca felt something cold and sharp crystallize in her chest, recognizing David's words as a direct attack not just on her professional competence, but on the value and dignity of the military and defense communities she'd served with distinction. He was essentially arguing that her relationships with Boeing, one of the world's most respected aerospace companies, and Amazon, the largest logistics operation on the planet, were somehow embarrassing associations that damaged the firm's reputation. The ignorance required to make such a statement was staggering in its scope. Jake Patterson, sensing the shift in David's tactics, attempted to provide support with an observation that revealed the depth of his own misunderstanding. "David makes a good point about brand positioning," he offered, his voice carrying the hollow confidence of someone repeating concepts he'd heard at networking events. "We want to be known for sophisticated financial and management consulting, not just operational troubleshooting for industrial clients." The way he said industrial clients made it sound like manual labor rather than the complex global logistics that kept entire economies functioning. Marcus Webb finally broke his silence, his voice carrying the kind of cold precision that came from 40 years of cutting through corporate nonsense. "David, are you seriously arguing that contracts worth $18 million in additional annual revenue are somehow detrimental to our firm's reputation?" He leaned forward slightly, his expression carrying the intensity of someone who had just heard something so fundamentally stupid that it required immediate correction. "Because if that's your position, I think we need to have a very different conversation about strategic vision and business priorities." The conference room's atmosphere shifted dramatically, as Marcus's words landed like artillery rounds on David's position. Rebecca recognized the moment as a tactical turning point, the instant when David's carefully planned attack had provoked a response from an unexpected quarter that would fundamentally alter the battlefield dynamic. Sarah Chen remained standing beside the table, her professional demeanor intact but her expression suggesting she was witnessing something unprecedented in her 15 years with the firm. David's face flushed red as he realized that Marcus's intervention represented a serious threat to his assumed authority in the room. Instead of backing down or acknowledging the weakness of his position, he escalated with the kind of personal attack that Rebecca recognized as the last resort of someone whose professional arguments had completely collapsed. "Marcus, I understand your concern about revenue numbers, but I think you're missing the bigger picture about leadership and organizational culture," he said, his tone shifting to something that carried barely concealed condescension. "Sometimes difficult decisions require us to prioritize long-term strategic health over short-term financial gain." The implications of David's words were unmistakable. He was suggesting that Marcus, a partner with 4 decades of successful consulting experience, was too focused on money to understand sophisticated business strategy. It was a tactical error so catastrophic that Rebecca almost felt embarrassed for him, watching someone systematically alienate every potential ally in the room while convincing himself that he was demonstrating leadership. The storm outside seemed to intensify in response to the chaos unfolding within the conference room, rain hammering against the windows with increasing violence. Rebecca remained silent, her military training keeping her focused on the broader tactical situation, while David continued his systematic self-destruction. Every word he spoke was providing her with additional ammunition for the counter-offensive she was preparing, building a case so overwhelming that his defeat would be absolute and unrecoverable when she finally chose to engage. David's face had taken on the particular shade of red that Rebecca associated with officers who had lost control of both their situations and their temper. The rain continued its relentless assault against the conference room windows, creating a percussion that seemed to match the accelerating tempo of his increasingly desperate attack. She watched him glance around the table, apparently searching for support that was rapidly evaporating, before his eyes settled back on her with the kind of focused hostility that preceded a final reckless assault. "You know what, Rebecca," David said, his voice shifting to a tone that carried personal venom barely disguised as professional criticism. "I think it's time we stopped dancing around the real issue here." He leaned forward aggressively, his body language abandoning any pretense of collegial discussion, in favor of something that looked uncomfortably close to interrogation. "The problem isn't just your methods or your client relationship. The problem is that you fundamentally don't understand your place in this organization." The words hung in the air like smoke from an incendiary device, their implications clear to everyone present. David was no longer attacking Rebecca's professional competence. He was challenging her right to exist as an equal partner in the firm that bore her own married name. Sarah Chen's professional composure cracked visibly, her expression showing the kind of shock that came from witnessing something unprecedented in 15 years of corporate observation. Marcus Webb's face had settled into the cold mask of someone calculating responses to what he clearly recognized as a declaration of war. "Let me be absolutely clear about something," David continued, his confidence building as he interpreted the room's stunned silence as validation, rather than horror at his tactical insanity. "This firm was built by my family, operates according to principles my father established, and succeeds because of relationships that took decades to develop." He gestured broadly, as if claiming ownership not just of the conference room but of the entire business reality surrounding them. "Your contributions, while I'm sure you find them personally satisfying, are ultimately peripheral to the core value proposition that makes Martinez Associates a respected name in the consulting industry." Rebecca felt her military training kick into full combat awareness, as she recognized David's words for what they were, a complete declaration of her irrelevance to the organization she had literally saved from financial collapse. He was stating, in front of witnesses, that her record-breaking performance was somehow less valuable than his inherited position and declining traditional client base. It was the kind of tactical error that revealed not just arrogance but a fundamental disconnection from objective reality that would make his eventual defeat even more devastating. Jake Patterson, apparently emboldened by David's escalation, decided to add his own contribution to what was rapidly becoming a coordinated assault. "I think what David's getting at is really important," he said, his voice carrying the artificial confidence of someone who believed he was supporting the winning side, "which is that we need to maintain focus on our core competencies and established market position, rather than chasing after contract work that doesn't align with our brand identity." The way he said contract work made it sound like manual labor rather than the multi-million-dollar consulting engagements that had become the firm's primary revenue source. The absurdity of Jake's comment would have been amusing if it hadn't been so revealing of the profound ignorance driving the entire attack. He was essentially arguing that securing major contracts with Fortune 100 companies was somehow beneath the dignity of a consulting firm that had been hemorrhaging traditional clients for 3 consecutive. Rebecca recognized the psychology at work rather than acknowledge their own failures. David and Jake were attempting to redefine success itself as a problem that needed to be solved. Marcus Webb's silence had become increasingly ominous, his expression shifting from shock to something that looked like barely controlled fury. Rebecca could see him cataloging every word of David's assault, recognizing not just the professional incompetence it revealed, but the personal disrespect it showed toward a woman who had demonstrably saved the firm from bankruptcy. As a Vietnam veteran himself, Marcus understood the implications of dismissing military experience and the kind of leadership competence it represented. David, apparently interpreting Marcus's silence as tacit approval rather than building rage, pressed his attack even further into territory that would prove impossible to retreat from. The bottom line, Rebecca, is that this firm needs leadership that understands traditional consulting values and long-term relationship building, he announced, his tone carrying the finality of someone delivering an ultimate. What you've been doing might generate some short-term revenue, but it's not sustainable, it's not replicable, and frankly, it's not what this company was built to do. Sarah Chen remained standing beside the conference table, her professional training apparently the only thing preventing her from responding to what she was witnessing. Rebecca recognized the expression on Sarah's face as the look of someone watching a train wreck unfold in slow motion, unable to intervene but horrified by the inevitable conclusion. The executive assistant had spent 15 years managing communications for successful business leaders. What she was observing now was so far outside normal corporate behavior that it seemed to violate the basic laws of professional physics. Rebecca felt the familiar calm that preceded decisive action, the moment when tactical planning gave way to execution. David had just provided her with everything she needed to end this confrontation permanently, delivering his position so completely that recovery would be impossible. The only question remaining was exactly how devastating she wanted his defeat to be when she finally revealed the true scope of his miscalculation. David's expression shifted to something that Rebecca recognized as the particular brand of cruelty that came from someone who believed they had already won. The conference room felt smaller somehow, the storm outside providing a dramatic backdrop to what was clearly meant to be his final, devastating blow. She watched him lean back in his chair with the satisfied confidence of someone preparing to deliver what he considered the ultimate professional humiliation, his eyes carrying the cold satisfaction of a predator moving in for the kill. "But you know what really bothers me about this whole situation, Rebecca?" David said, his voice dropping to the kind of intimate tone that made personal attacks feel like confidential revelations. "It's not just that you don't understand business strategy or sustainable client development, it's that you've never really contributed anything meaningful to this firm beyond riding on the coattails of connections you made while playing soldier." The way he said playing soldier carried such dismissive contempt that even Jake Patterson visibly winced at the viciousness of it. The words hit the conference room like a physical blow, their impact so profound that Sarah Chen actually stepped backward as if she'd been struck. Marcus Webb's face went completely white, his expression transforming from controlled anger to something approaching murderous rage. In 40 years of corporate consulting, including his own service in Vietnam, he had never heard anyone describe military service as playing soldier, especially not in reference to someone who had commanded logistics operations in an active combat zone. Rebecca felt something shift inside her chest, a cold crystallization that she recognized from the moment her convoy had come under fire outside Fallujah 5 years earlier. David had just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, attacking not just her professional competence, but the sacrifices and service of every soldier who had ever worn the uniform. The casual dismissal of military service as playing revealed a level of ignorance and disrespect that demanded correction with overwhelming force. "And let's be completely honest about your situation here," David continued, apparently oblivious to the way the room's atmosphere had shifted from tense confrontation to something approaching open warfare. "You contribute nothing to this firm that couldn't be replaced by any competent operations manager with the right industry connection. Your military background might impress some defense contractors, but in the real business world, it's essentially irrelevant experience dressed up as expertise." The phrase "contribute nothing" hung in the air like an unexploded ordnance, its implications so devastating that Rebecca felt her entire worldview recalibrate around the moment. David had just declared in front of witnesses that the woman who had generated more revenue than the rest of the firm combined contributed nothing of value. It was such a profound disconnection from objective reality that it almost seemed like a form of clinical delusion rather than simple professional disagreement. Jake Patterson, apparently sensing that David had delivered his killing blow, decided to add his own contribution to what he clearly believed was Rebecca's professional execution. "I think what David's saying is really important," he offered, his voice carrying the satisfied tone of someone who believed he was witnessing justice being served, which is that we need to focus on authentic business development rather than relying on specialized backgrounds that don't translate to general consulting competency. Rebecca looked around the conference room, taking in the faces of the people who had just declared her military service meaningless and her business contributions worthless. David's expression carried the satisfied cruelty of someone who believed he had just delivered a career-ending blow. Jake's nervous energy had transformed into something approaching glee as he watched what he assumed was Rebecca's humiliation. Even the storm outside seemed to pause, as if nature itself was holding its breath for what was about to unfold. Sarah Chen remained frozen beside the conference table, her 15 years of professional experience providing no framework for processing what she was witnessing. The executive assistant's expression suggested she was watching something so far outside normal corporate behavior that it challenged her understanding of how professional relationships function. Marcus Webb's silence had become absolutely thunderous, his face carrying the kind of controlled rage that came from watching someone attack values he had literally bled to defend. Rebecca thought about Emma, probably finishing her homework at after-school care, trusting that her mother was building a stable future for their family. She thought about the soldiers she had commanded in Iraq, men and women who had followed her orders through hostile territory because they trusted her competence and leadership. She thought about the Boeing engineers who called her directly when they needed solutions to problems that traditional consultants couldn't handle, and the Amazon executives who had specifically requested her team for their most critical supply chain challenges. Most of all, she thought about the quarterly reports sitting unopened in front of each partner, documents that contained data so devastating to David's narrative that revealing their contents would be like detonating a tactical nuclear device in the middle of his carefully constructed delusion. The moment had arrived when silence was no longer an option, when the accumulated weight of evidence demanded to be heard, and when the true scope of David's miscalculation was about to be revealed with surgical precision. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable, visible to anyone who understood the difference between submission and strategic patience. Rebecca's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, her shoulders squaring with the kind of confident bearing that came from years of command responsibility. Her eyes moved slowly around the table, making brief contact with each person present before settling on David with the focused intensity of someone who had just made a tactical decision that would change everything. The conference room fell into a silence so complete that the only sounds were the storm battering the windows and the subtle hum of the air conditioning system struggling against the building tension. Rebecca placed her hands flat on the mahogany table, her movements deliberate and controlled in the way that preceded major tactical decisions. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a quality that none of them had heard before, the calm, measured authority of someone who had commanded soldiers in combat and was now applying that same leadership presence to a corporate battlefield. "David," she said quietly, her tone carrying the kind of professional courtesy that preceded devastating military briefings, "I'm going to give you one opportunity to reconsider what you've just said." The words were spoken with such controlled precision that even Jake Patterson stopped his nervous fidgeting and focused completely on her face. "I want you to think very carefully about whether you really want to continue down this particular path of conversation, because once we cross certain lines, there's no going back." The warning was delivered with the same calm professionalism that Rebecca had once used to advise superior officers when their tactical decisions were about to result in catastrophic casualties. David, however, interpreted her measured tone as evidence of weakness rather than the strategic restraint it actually represented. His expression shifted to something approaching triumphant satisfaction, as if he believed her attempt at dignity was actually a form of surrender disguised as defiance. Marcus Webb leaned forward slightly, his experienced eye recognizing the shift in Rebecca's demeanor as something far more significant than David was apparently capable of understanding. As a fellow veteran, Marcus had seen the moment when trained leaders moved from defensive positioning to offensive preparation, and he recognized the signs in Rebecca's bearing with crystal clarity. The senior partner's expression carried a mixture of anticipation and concern, as if he was watching someone prepare to deploy weapons that would leave no survivors on the opposing side. Sarah Chen remained motionless beside the conference table, her professional instincts keeping her present despite the obvious tension, while her survival instincts warned her that she was about to witness something unprecedented in corporate consulting. The executive assistant's position gave her access to information that none of the partners fully understood, and she alone knew exactly how devastating Rebecca's counterattack would be when it finally came. Her expression carried the nervous anticipation of someone watching a controlled demolition, knowing that the explosion was both inevitable and precisely calculated. "You know what, Rebecca?" David responded, his confidence building as he misinterpreted her warning as a sign that his attack was working. "I think we're past the point of diplomatic language and careful considerations. This is exactly the kind of conversation this firm has needed for a long time." He gestured broadly, as if claiming ownership of both the moment and the moral authority to define its significance. Sometimes leadership requires making difficult decisions about people who aren't contributing at the level the organization requires. The casual cruelty in David's voice was matched by Jake Patterson's eager nodding, both men apparently convinced that they were witnessing Rebecca's final capitulation, rather than her preparation for total warfare. Jake's expression carried the satisfied anticipation of someone who believed he was about to see justice delivered to someone who had somehow gotten above her proper station. Neither man seemed capable of recognizing that Rebecca's warning had been genuine strategic intelligence rather than desperate negotiation. Rebecca opened the portfolio in front of her with movements so deliberate and controlled that they seemed almost ceremonial. The quarterly reports lay inside like classified documents waiting to be declassified, their contents representing information so devastating to David's position that revealing them would constitute the corporate equivalent of a nuclear strike. She looked up from the documents to meet David's eyes directly, her expression carrying the kind of focused intensity that preceded irreversible tactical decision. "I want to be absolutely clear about something before we continue," Rebecca said, her voice maintaining its calm professionalism, while carrying an undertone that made even Jake Patterson's nervous energy still complete. "Are you stating, for the record and in front of witnesses, that my military service was meaningless, that my business contributions have been worthless, and that I contribute nothing of value to this organization?" She paused, allowing the weight of the question to settle over the room like smoke from an approaching artillery barrage. The question was delivered with the precision of someone setting up a legal framework for what was about to unfold, creating an official record of David's position that would make his eventual defeat both complete and irrefutable. Marcus Webb's eyebrows rose slightly as he recognized the tactical sophistication of Rebecca's approach, understanding that she was not just responding to David's attack, but systematically constructing the foundation for his total professional destruction. David's face flushed with the particular shade of red that came from someone who believed they were finally being given the opportunity to speak truth to power. "Yes, Rebecca, that's exactly what I'm saying," he declared with the confident finality of someone delivering what he considered a coup de grace. "Your military background is irrelevant to consulting, your client relationships are unsustainable, and your overall contribution to this firm has been essentially worthless despite whatever temporary revenue bumps you might have generated." The words hung in the conference room air like a signed confession, their implications so profound that Sarah Chen actually closed her eyes as if she couldn't bear to witness what was about to happen. Rebecca nodded once, a small movement that carried the weight of final confirmation, and opened her quarterly report to the first page of data that would systematically destroy every assumption David had just made about reality. David's confidence reached its absolute peak as he interpreted Rebecca's silence as confirmation of his tactical victory. The storm outside seemed to pause in anticipation, rain still falling but with less violence, as if nature itself was holding its breath for what was about to unfold. He leaned back in his chair with the satisfied posture of someone who believed he had just delivered a career-ending blow, his expression carrying the particular brand of cruelty that came from watching someone accept their professional execution with dignity. "I'm glad we can finally have this honest conversation," David announced, his voice carrying the magnanimous tone of someone who believed he was being generous in victory, "because I think it's important for everyone in this room to understand exactly where we stand as an organization." He gestured toward Rebecca with casual dismissiveness, as if she had just been reduced to an object lesson rather than a participating member of the discussion. "This is what happens when we allow sentiment and personal relationships to override sound business judgment." Jake Patterson, emboldened by what he perceived as David's complete dominance of the situation, decided to add his own contribution to what he clearly believed was Rebecca's professional funeral. "It's really a valuable lesson about maintaining focus on core competencies and traditional consulting methodologies," he offered, his voice carrying the satisfied tone of someone who believed he was witnessing justice being served. "Sometimes you have to make difficult decisions about restructuring, even when it involves people you care about personally." The casual condescension in Jake's voice was particularly galling, coming from someone whose own division had lost money for 3 consecutive quarters, while Rebecca's operations consulting had generated record profit. Marcus Webb's expression had shifted to something approaching fascinated horror, as if he was watching someone walk deliberately into a minefield while congratulating themselves on their navigation skills. Sarah Chen remained frozen beside the conference table, her professional training the only thing preventing her from warning David about the magnitude of his miscalculation. David stood up from his chair with theatrical deliberation, moving to the windows where he could look out at the Seattle skyline while addressing the room with the kind of staged authority that he apparently believed made his pronouncements more meaningful. The gesture was clearly intended to emphasize his position as the room's dominant figure, someone comfortable enough with his power to literally look down on both the city and the people he was addressing. "You know what the real problem has been," Rebecca, David said, his back turned to the table as he spoke to the storm-darkened windows, his voice carrying the kind of philosophical reflection that suggested he believed he was delivering profound insights rather than revealing the depth of his ignorance. "The problem is that this firm tried to be something it wasn't designed to be. We got distracted by short-term revenue opportunities and forgot about our core mission as strategic business consultant." The irony of David's statement would have been amusing if it hadn't been so tragically disconnected from the financial reality that had kept his firm from bankruptcy over the past 3 years. He was essentially arguing that success was a distraction from their mission to provide strategic consulting, as if generating results for major clients was somehow incompatible with their professional identity. Rebecca recognized the psychology at work, rather than acknowledge that Rebecca's methods were superior to his own. David was redefining success itself as a betrayal of their values. "Which brings me to my final point," David continued, turning back to face the conference table with the kind of dramatic timing that suggested he believed he was delivering a climactic speech rather than sealing his own professional fate. "And the decision that I think this situation requires from us as responsible business leaders." He moved back toward his chair with deliberate slowness, clearly savoring what he believed was his moment of ultimate authority and vindication. Rebecca watched David's performance with the detached interest of someone observing a tactical demonstration of how not to conduct corporate warfare. Every word he spoke was providing additional evidence for the case she was about to present, building a record of arrogance and ignorance so comprehensive that his eventual defeat would serve as a cautionary tale for generations of business students. She remained perfectly still, her hands resting on the closed quarterly reports that contained information so devastating to David's narrative that revealing it would be like detonating a precision-guided munition in the center of his carefully constructed delusion. "I think it's time we seriously consider terminating Rebecca's partnership in this firm," David announced with the finality of someone delivering a death sentence, his voice carrying the satisfied authority of someone who believed he had just solved a complex problem with elegant simplicity. "We need to return to our core focus, rebuild our traditional client relationships, and restore the kind of strategic consulting excellence that my father built this company to represent." The words landed in the conference room like an unexploded bomb, their implications so profound that even Jake Patterson seemed momentarily stunned by their audacity. David had just declared his intention to fire the woman whose division had generated more revenue than the rest of the firm combined, while simultaneously claiming that her success was somehow incompatible with business excellence. It was such a complete disconnection from objective reality that it transcended simple ignorance and entered the realm of clinical delusion. Sarah Chen's professional composure finally cracked completely, her expression showing the kind of shock that came from witnessing something so far outside normal corporate behavior that it challenged her understanding of how business relationships function. Marcus Webb's face had settled into the cold mask of someone calculating the precise magnitude of the catastrophe he was witnessing, recognizing that David had just committed professional suicide with such thoroughness that recovery would be impossible. Rebecca looked down at the quarterly reports one final time, then back up at David with the kind of calm focus that preceded the delivery of overwhelming force. The moment had arrived when silence was no longer tactical. It was time to reveal exactly how catastrophically David had misjudged both the situation and the woman he had just attempted to destroy. Rebecca stood slowly, her movement carrying the controlled precision of someone who had commanded troops under fire, and was now applying that same leadership presence to a corporate battlefield. When she spoke, her voice cut through the conference room's tension with the authority of someone who had earned the right to be heard through demonstrated competence, rather than inherited position. "David," she said, opening the first quarterly report with deliberate ceremony, "since you've made your position crystal clear, I think it's time everyone in this room understood exactly what you're proposing to terminate." Her words carried the calm professionalism of a military briefing officer, presenting intelligence that would fundamentally alter strategic planning. Let's start with some basic financial data that apparently hasn't made it into your decision-making process. The first page of Rebecca's report contained a simple chart that landed in the conference room like a tactical nuclear device. Operations Consulting Division Revenue, Q3 2024, $12.7 million, she announced, her voice maintaining its steady cadence while the numbers hit David's position like precision artillery. Traditional Management Consulting Division Revenue, same period $4.1 million. She paused, allowing the mathematics to settle over the room like fallout from an explosion. Your division, David, generated less than 1/3 of what mine did this quarter. David's face cycled through confusion, denial, and something approaching panic as the implications of Rebecca's numbers began to penetrate his carefully constructed narrative. Jake Patterson's nervous energy had transformed into frozen shock, his expression showing the kind of disbelief that came from watching fundamental assumptions about reality collapse in real time. Marcus Webb leaned forward with sharp interest, his experienced eye recognizing the precision of Rebecca's tactical approach as she systematically dismantled every argument that had been made against her. "But let's dig deeper into these sustainability concerns you've raised," Rebecca continued, turning to the second page with the fluid confidence of someone who had prepared for this battle with military thoroughness. "Client retention rates. Operations Consulting, 97%. Traditional Consulting, 62%. She looked directly at David, her expression carrying the kind of focused intensity that came from delivering mission-critical intelligence. "Your clients, David, are leaving at nearly 6 times the rate mine." Sarah Chen had recovered her professional composure enough to move closer to the table, her 15 years of administrative experience allowing her to recognize the devastating precision of Rebecca's data presentation. The executive assistant's expression carried a mixture of vindication and amazement, as if she was finally witnessing someone with the authority and evidence to confront the willful ignorance she had observed for years. "Now, regarding these unsustainable government connections you've been so concerned about," Rebecca said, her tone carrying just enough sarcasm to make the quotation marks audible, "let me share some information about our actual client portfolio." She flipped to a page that contained logos and contract values, her presentation building momentum like an artillery barrage moving from ranging shots to devastating direct hits. Boeing, Civilian Aerospace Consulting, nothing classified, nothing government-specific. Amazon, Private Sector Logistics Optimization, completely commercial applications. The conference room's atmosphere had shifted completely, with David no longer commanding the space but instead looking like someone watching his entire worldview collapse under the weight of objective evidence. Rebecca's military training was evident in every aspect of her presentation: the systematic approach, the overwhelming documentation, and the strategic patience that had allowed her opponents to commit fully to positions that were now proving impossible to defend. Microsoft, Tesla, Costco, Starbucks, Rebecca continued, reading from a client list that represented the cream of Pacific Northwest business leadership, all private sector, all seeking operations consulting expertise, all specifically requesting our team based on demonstrated results rather than inherited relationships. She looked around the table, making eye contact with each partner before settling her gaze on David with laser-like intensity. These clients chose us because we solve problems that traditional consulting approaches can't handle. Jake Patterson attempted to salvage something from the wreckage of their position, his voice carrying the desperate quality of someone grasping for any available defense. But Rebecca, revenue numbers don't tell the whole story about strategic value and long-term positioning, he offered, though his words lacked conviction even as he spoke them. We need to consider broader factors like brand alignment and market positioning. Rebecca's response was delivered with the kind of surgical precision that came from years of dismantling enemy positions under combat conditions. Jake, your financial advisory division lost both Microsoft and Amazon as clients this quarter because, according to their exit interviews, your recommendations were theoretical rather than practical, and showed insufficient understanding of operational reality. She consulted her notes with casual efficiency. They moved their business to our operations consulting team, where we've increased their efficiency metrics by 37% and reduced their operational costs by $8.2 million annually. The silence that followed Rebecca's statement was so complete it seemed to have physical weight, pressing down on the conference room like atmospheric pressure before a major storm. David's carefully constructed attack had been systematically destroyed by data so overwhelming that denial was no longer psychologically possible. Every assumption he had made about Rebecca's value, every dismissive comment about her methods, every condescending reference to her military background had been revealed as not just wrong, but catastrophically disconnected from the financial reality that had kept his own firm operation. Marcus Webb broke the silence with the kind of measured observation that came from 40 years of business experience. Rebecca, if I'm reading these numbers correctly, your division didn't just outperform the rest of the firm this quarter, he said, his voice carrying growing amazement as he processed the full scope of what she had revealed. You essentially subsidized everyone else's operations while they criticized your methods. Rebecca nodded with the calm satisfaction of someone whose tactical plan had achieved its intended objectives. That's correct, Mark. While David was questioning my contributions, my division was generating sufficient revenue to cover the losses from traditional consulting and financial advisory combined, plus show a net profit that exceeded our previous annual record. The conference room had become a battlefield where one side possessed overwhelming firepower while the other had committed to a position that was now revealed as completely indefensible. Rebecca moved to the final section of her presentation with the methodical precision of someone conducting a professional execution. The storm outside had intensified again, as if nature itself was providing dramatic accompaniment to the systematic destruction of David's career that was unfolding within the conference room. She opened to a page that contained information so devastating that even she paused briefly before revealing it, understanding that what she was about to share would fundamentally alter the power structure of Martinez and Associates forever. Now, Dave, since you've expressed such strong opinions about my contributions and my future with this firm, Rebecca said, her voice carrying the kind of calm authority that preceded irreversible tactical decisions. I think you should understand exactly what terminating my partnership would mean for the organization that bears my married name. She looked around the table, making eye contact with each person present before delivering the information that would serve as David's professional death sentence. Lockheed Martin offered me a position 2 weeks ago as Director of Civilian Consulting Operations. Rebecca announced, her words landing in the conference room like a precision-guided munition striking its intended target. Salary, $450,000 annually, plus equity participation and full autonomy over strategic direction. I turned it down because I believed this firm was worth fighting for. She paused, allowing the implications to settle over the room like smoke from an explosion. However, the offer remains open until Friday. David's face went completely white as the full scope of his miscalculation became clear. He had just attempted to fire someone who was not only the firm's top revenue generator but also someone with immediate access to opportunities that dwarfed anything Martinez and Associates could offer. Jake Patterson looked like he was experiencing some form of medical emergency, his nervous energy having transformed into complete paralysis as he processed the magnitude of the disaster he had helped create. But here's the truly interesting part, Rebecca continued, her presentation building toward a crescendo that would leave no possibility of recovery for her opponents. Because when I spoke with Lockheed Martin's senior management about the transition timeline, they mentioned something fascinating about industry consolidation and strategic partnership. She smiled with the kind of controlled satisfaction that came from watching a perfectly executed plan reach its intended conclusion. Marcus Webb leaned forward with the sharp attention of someone recognizing a developing situation that would require immediate strategic response. Sarah Chen had moved closer to the table, her professional instincts telling her that she was witnessing something that would become legendary in corporate consulting circles. The executive assistant's expression carried a mixture of anticipation and concern, as if she understood that the next few minutes would determine the future of everyone present. They're looking to acquire a Pacific Northwest consulting firm to serve as their civilian operations base, Rebecca revealed, her words carrying the weight of information that would reshape everyone's understanding of the current situation. A firm with established client relationships, proven operational expertise, and leadership that understands both military precision and corporate strategy. She looked directly at David, her expression carrying the kind of focused intensity that preceded the delivery of overwhelming force. The implications of Rebecca's revelation hit the conference room like a series of controlled explosions, each more devastating than the last. Not only had David attempted to fire the firm's most valuable asset, but he had done so at the exact moment when that asset represented their pathway to a transformational business opportunity that would secure everyone's financial future for decades. It was such a profound tactical blunder that it transcended simple professional incompetence and entered the realm of catastrophic leadership failure. David, Rebecca said, her voice carrying the finality of someone delivering a strategic ultimatum based on your performance as managing partner, your systematic dismissal of the division that has kept this firm financially viable, and your stated intention to terminate my partnership. I'm exercising my rights under our partnership agreement to call for an immediate vote of no confidence in your leadership. She reached into her portfolio and withdrew a document that had clearly been prepared in advance, her planning evidencing the kind of strategic foresight that came from military training applied to corporate warfare. The partnership agreement that David's own father had drafted contained provisions that none of the current partners had apparently bothered to review in recent years. Rebecca's military background had taught her the importance of understanding the legal frameworks that governed organizational structures, and she had spent considerable time studying the documents that defined power relationships within Martinez and Associates. What she had discovered was a mechanism for removing incompetent leadership that the founders had included as protection against exactly the kind of situation David had just created. According to Section 7 of our partnership agreement, Rebecca continued, reading from the document with legal precision, any partner can initiate a leadership review based on demonstrated incompetence, financial mismanagement, or actions detrimental to the firm's strategic interest. She looked around the table, her expression carrying the authority of someone who had done her homework with military thoroughness. I'm formally charging you with all three, and requesting an immediate vote from all remaining partners. Marcus Webb's voice cut through the stunned silence with the authority of someone who had just recognized the legal and strategic brilliance of Rebecca's approach. I second the motion, he announced, his words carrying the weight of 40 years of business experience and the moral authority of someone who had watched David's incompetence nearly destroy a firm he had helped build. All in favor of removing David Martinez as managing partner of Martinez and Associates. The vote was swift and unanimous among the remaining partners, with even Jake Patterson unable to support David's position in the face of overwhelming evidence of his professional failure. Rebecca had just executed a corporate coup with such precision and legal authority that resistance was impossible, transforming herself from target of termination to the firm's new leadership in the span of a single meeting. David sat in stunned silence as the reality of his situation penetrated his consciousness. In the span of 30 minutes, He had gone from confident authority figure to terminated employee, his career destroyed by the same woman he had attempted to dismiss as worthless. The irony was so complete that it seemed almost scripted, a perfect demonstration of what happened when arrogance collided with competence in corporate warfare. The Seattle skyline gleamed through the conference room windows as the storm began to clear, afternoon sunlight breaking through the clouds like a spotlight illuminating the transformed landscape of Martinez and Associates. Rebecca stood at the head of the mahogany table where David had sat just an hour earlier, her posture carrying the quiet authority of someone who had never sought power but had proven worthy of wielding it when circumstances demanded action. "Sarah," Rebecca said, her voice carrying the calm professionalism that would define her leadership style, "please prepare David's severance package according to our standard partnership dissolution procedures. He'll need to clear his office by end of business Friday." She turned to face David directly, her expression showing neither triumph nor malice, only the kind of professional courtesy that came from someone who understood the difference between justice and revenge. "David, I want you to know that despite everything that's happened here today, you'll receive full compensation for your partnership stake and a positive reference for your future endeavor." The magnanimity of Rebecca's response left even Marcus Webb visibly impressed, recognizing the leadership wisdom in her refusal to humiliate someone who had just attempted to destroy her career. David's face showed a mixture of shock, gratitude, and what might have been the first glimmer of genuine respect he had ever shown for the woman he had systematically underestimated for 3 years. Jake Patterson remained frozen in his chair, apparently still processing the magnitude of the transformation he had just witnessed. "The Lockheed Martin partnership will move forward," Rebecca continued, addressing the room with the kind of strategic vision that came from military training applied to business leadership, but not as an acquisition. "We'll structure it as a joint venture that maintains our independence while giving us access to their resources and government contracting capabilities." She smiled with quiet satisfaction as she outlined a future that would benefit everyone present except the man who had tried to prevent. "Conservative projections show we'll triple our revenue within 18 months while expanding our team by 200%. Sarah Chen stepped forward with the kind of professional pride that came from working for leadership she could finally respect completely. "Rebecca, Boeing called while you were in the meeting," she announced, her voice carrying barely controlled excitement. "They want to expand the logistics consulting to include their space division. The contract value would be approximately $35 million over 3 years. She paused, savoring the moment before delivering the final detail. "They specifically requested that you personally oversee the entire engagement." The numbers hit the conference room like validation from the universe itself, confirming that Rebecca's methods weren't just successful but were being recognized by some of the world's most sophisticated organizations as essential capabilities they couldn't find elsewhere. Marcus Webb shook his head in amazement, his 40 years of consulting experience providing no framework for the kind of growth trajectory Rebecca had created in less than 3 years. "There's something else I want everyone to understand," Rebecca said, her tone shifting to something more personal as she prepared to address the human dimension of what had just occurred. "When David said I contribute nothing to this firm, he wasn't just attacking my professional competence, he was dismissing the service and sacrifice of every veteran who has ever worn this country's uniform." Her voice carried the quiet strength that came from speaking for those who couldn't speak for themselves. "Military service doesn't make someone automatically qualified for civilian leadership, but it does teach lessons about loyalty, sacrifice, and earned respect that apparently some people never learn." She walked to the windows where David had stood during his moment of perceived triumph, looking out at the Seattle skyline that represented the community of businesses she had served with distinction. "I didn't want this confrontation, and I certainly didn't want to see anyone lose their position," Rebecca continued, her reflection visible in the glass as she spoke to the room behind her. "But sometimes people push situations to points where choices have to be made between what's comfortable and what's right." Rebecca turned back to face the conference table, her expression carrying the kind of quiet authority that made further explanation unnecessary. "From now on, this firm will operate according to principles that every military leader understands: competence over connections, results over rhetoric, and earned respect over inherited authority." She looked directly at Jake Patterson, her gaze carrying both challenge and opportunity. "Jake, your division's performance needs immediate improvement. You have 60 days to show measurable progress, or we'll need to discuss restructuring your role. The transformation was complete in every meaningful sense. Martinez and Associates had evolved from a struggling traditional consulting firm run by inherited privilege into a performance-driven organization, led by demonstrated competence. Rebecca had not only survived David's attack, but had used his assault as the catalyst for assuming the leadership position that her results had always justified but that circumstances had never previously allowed. As David gathered his papers and prepared to leave the conference room for the last time as a partner, he paused at the door and looked back at Rebecca with an expression that carried genuine regret. "Rebecca," he said quietly, his voice stripped of its earlier arrogance and condescension, "I was wrong about everything, about you, about your service, about what this company needed." He swallowed hard before continuing. "I hope someday I can learn to lead with even half the integrity you've shown here today." Rebecca nodded acknowledgement of his words, her response carrying the grace that came from someone who understood that true victory didn't require humiliating the defeat. "David, you're a smart man who lost sight of what really matters in business," she replied. "Learn from this experience, and you'll be fine." 6 months later, Martinez and Associates had become the most sought-after operations consulting firm on the West Coast, with a waiting list of Fortune 500 companies requesting Rebecca's expertise. The Lockheed Martin partnership had opened doors to government efficiency consulting that generated revenue streams David's traditional approach could never have accessed. Most importantly, the firm's culture had transformed into one where results were celebrated, competence was rewarded, and every employee understood that their contributions were valued based on performance rather than politics. The conference room where David had once declared that Rebecca contributed nothing now contained a framed copy of the company's first $100 million contract, signed by clients who had specifically requested her leadership. Below it hung a simple plaque with words that had become the firm's unofficial motto: "Never underestimate quiet competence." The moral of the story was clear to everyone who heard it: true strength doesn't announce itself with arrogance or demand respect through intimidation. Real leaders earn their authority through competence, maintain their power through results, and demonstrate their character through how they treat others when they have every right to seek revenge. Sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one with the most to say, and the most dangerous opponent is the one who lets you defeat yourself while they prepare to show you what actual capability looks like. Rebecca Martinez had learned in the crucible of military service that leadership isn't about the authority to give orders, it's about the responsibility to deliver results, while protecting those who depend on your decision. When David said she contributed nothing, he revealed everything about his own limitations and nothing about her. In the end, the woman he tried to dismiss as worthless proved that worth isn't measured by volume or inherited position, but by the quiet competence that transforms challenges into victories and obstacles into opportunities. The rain had stopped completely, and Seattle's skyline gleamed in the afternoon sunlight, bearing witness to a story that would become legend in business circles. The day a veteran showed the corporate world what happens when you mistake quiet dignity for weakness, and learn too late that some battles are won not by those who talk the loudest, but by those who prepare the most thoroughly for the moment when talking ends and results matter most. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.